which he hammered time and again is that Labour were not straight with the British people during the election campaign, that taxes are going up, which we absolutely heard in the budget, spending is going up, and so is borrowing. He said that Rachel Reeves is fiddling the figures when it comes to borrowing, as she says, for long-term investment. Let's discuss everything that we heard first in the budget and the response from Rishi Sunak with our guests for this part of our special budget programme. Delighted to say we have the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Darren Jones, and Vicky Young has joined us as the BBC's Deputy Political Editor. The BBC's Economics Editor, Faisal Islam, is still here, and we've been joined by Paul Johnson from the Institute for Fiscal Studies. First of all, Paul Johnson, before we get to Darren Jones, the figures were quite extraordinary in the budget that Rachel Reeves outlined, particularly on the level of taxes and how much they are going to increase. What was your reaction?
Well, as we expected, it's a very, very big budget. I mean, these are huge tax increases, £40 billion in the scorecard, and taxes as a fraction of national income reaching record levels. But I think two other things are very striking. One is a big increase in borrowing, mostly to increase spending on investment, which is what the Chancellor says she wants to focus on, but not entirely for that. Also, it's part of what's paying for additional day-to-day public spending. But the other thing that's really striking is there's a huge increase in spending this year and next on day-to-day spending, and then it flattens off almost completely. So there's a huge gamble here, which is that there's a really big increase in day-to-day spending on the NHS this year and next. So part of the gamble is, can you spend that much, that quickly, efficiently? And then not quite a return to austerity after that, but nothing really. I mean, it basically flattens off after that. And if you take these numbers seriously, we would say you really struggle to see any further growth in spending for non-protected departments. So the danger, I think, for the government is they have to come back again and ask for more tax revenue or more borrowing in order to meet any further claims on spending, unless, of course, they do better on growth than the OBR is forecasting. The last thing I think is very striking. What does the OBR say in here about growth? It says this budget will increase growth in the next year or two, essentially because it's increasing demand in the economy, but it will increase inflation, it'll increase interest rates, and it will slow growth over the last 3 years of the forecast period.
Well, just before I come to your reaction to that, what happens in 2 years' time? You come back for more money from working people, and we'll discuss the definition in just a moment. But what do you say to what you've just heard from Paul Johnson, Darren Jones?
Look, our promise at the election not to increase income tax, national insurance or VAT on working people is a promise that has been honoured today in this budget. Yes, very clearly. There's not been an increase in income tax, national insurance or VAT that working people will pay. They will see that in their pay slips at the end of this month and every other month following. That is not just a promise for this budget, that is a promise for the whole of this Parliament. So I can categorically tell you today that we will not be coming back in future budgets to break that manifesto commitment. It is a commitment that lasts between the last election and the next.
Can I just ask you, Paul Johnson, we just heard there from Darren Jones that this is not a breach of the manifesto going into the election, and I think we'll be able to show that manifesto commitment. But when we are talking about honesty and what most people would think when they read that part of the manifesto, is this increase in employers' national insurance contributions a breach of that commitment? Here it is. Labour will not increase taxes on working people, which is why we will not increase national insurance, the basic, higher or additional rates of income tax or VAT. In terms of that increase on national insurance contributions, is that in line with that manifesto?
I think I'd say two things. First, if you're going to raise anything like this amount of tax, and I understand entirely why the government has done it, they had to raise one of those three taxes. So whether it's a breach or not, it was the right thing to do that. But you just read it out. It says we will not increase national insurance contributions.
You have increased national insurance contributions. And it is, as Rishi Sunak says, Darren Jones, about trust. Now, whether you think you've kept to the sort of letter of what that says, for most people reading that, they will not have assumed that national insurance contributions will have gone up on employers, and they've gone up substantially to raise the money that you needed. And we'll put that to aside whether it was the right thing to do. Will you now sit here and say you can understand why most people who have watched closely about what you promised in the election and what Rachel Reeves has announced now, they are two different things? She has contradicted what you said.
No, and I don't accept that, because if you look at the wording on that manifesto page, it's very clear that we're talking about people that go to work. People who go to work get paid a salary. They receive a pay slip. They directly pay income tax or national insurance on that pay slip. We made a promise not to increase those taxes. We have not increased those taxes today. So that is a promise that has been honoured. And I just do not accept the premise that in any way there is a breach of that commitment in the manifesto, because it's plainly very clear what we promised to working people. And I think most people, having read that manifesto, know exactly what it means.
All right, well, let's
today.
let's choose something else that Keir Starmer said before he became Prime Minister. There'll be no surprises on tax. How would you describe the announcement of £20 billion worth of tax rises on national insurance contributions by employers?
There is no surprise on tax, because we set out in our manifesto our promises. We said we were going to honour these commitments to workers, which we have honoured. We've set out that we're going to close the non-dom loophole. We're going to put VAT on private schools. We're going to increase the taxes on windfall profits for the oil and gas industry and close some of the loopholes for private equity bosses. We've done all of those things. It's very clearly set out in the manifesto. And look,
All right.
I will accept that this is a budget that meets the scale of the challenges we face as a country. But as the Chancellor said today, you can either choose to make these choices and tackle those challenges, or you can choose to continue what the Conservatives did, which was essentially to lie to the public about the state of the public finances. We are not willing to do that. And if people want to challenge our choices, that's fine, but they have to set out what the alternatives would be.
Well, we'll come on to that, but let's just go... Yes, do.
Just reading from the Office of Budget Responsibility in terms of the employer initial insurance, the OBR has significantly downgraded its expectation of household disposable income growth as a direct result, it says here, of increases in the employer's national insurance being passed on to wages. So you're right, it won't appear in the pay slip, but we are arguing on the head of a pin here, aren't we? This is, £40 billion of tax is paid by someone, and I think all economists would agree that nearly all of it will effectively be paid by employees.
But Paul, answer the simple question. Have we increased the rate of national insurance that workers pay on their payslip? The answer is no, isn't it?
That's not what it said. Well, let's not get
That's
this
the
answer
answer.
down
But
in the
hang on.
manifesto,
That's the
but the point
broadly,
is, it's reducing income.
you are relying very heavily, as I say, on the letter. It won't appear in payslips. But Paul Johnson is right. Further down the line, it could result in lower wages for working people. This is not a cost-free budget for working people. Before you answer it, let's just have a listen and remind ourselves what Keir Starmer said during the election campaign.
All our plans are set out in the manifesto, fully costed, fully funded, and none of them, all launched yesterday, require tax increases over and above the ones we've set out. We are going to deal with the non-dom tax status. We are going to deal with the private equity loophole. We are going to deal with the tax break for private schools and the tax that we need to introduce or to extend on oil and gas companies. But none of our plans require any other tax rises.
No. Well, that's just not true, is it? No tax increases over and above the only two things that were stated in the manifesto and during the campaign, the VAT on private school fees and the closing of the non-dom status. There'd be no other tax increases. That is straightforwardly not the case. You've just announced £40 billion worth of tax rises, maybe rightly for the reasons you've said, but that is not consistent, let me put it that way, with what you said during the election.
Joe, that's just wrong. The first part of what the Prime Minister said then was that our manifesto commitments, the new things that we're going to do, which we called our first steps, were funded by the tax changes in our manifesto. That has been done today. So why have we had to increase taxes more broadly than that? Because we found this £22 billion black hole in the public finances each and every year of the next 5 years. And as the Chancellor said, you've got a choice. Are you either going to cut public services and spending by £22 billion to get a grip of that? Or are you going to actually put that money into stabilising our public services so that we can get on with reform and growth? That's the choice we've taken today.
Well, let's talk about growth, and then I will invite my colleagues here to ask some questions too. Let's talk about growth. Growth is the number one priority. It's your number one mission. And yet, the announcement of those tax rises on national insurance employer contributions, just as a start, there are others, capital gains tax, inheritance tax changes, and so on. You are stifling the very machine that will create growth. Governments don't make growth, you create a climate. And you've done the exact opposite. What was it in this budget that will incentivise businesses to take people on and expand?
Well, there are two parts to that question. I'll take both of them. First, on growth, if you look at the Office of Budget Responsibility documents, they're very clear that we go from 1.1 to 1.6 in terms of the rate of growth over the 5-year period, with a bump at the start of the first 5 years. That means that the economy is growing, and if you look backwards, it's growing better than it does over the past few years. So the economy is growing over the forecast period. Do we want more growth? Absolutely.
You'll need it. Everyone want it.
We recognise that, as well as the need to reform our public services, but you can't just achieve that in one budget. That is the hard yards we have to now work on over the years ahead. But
And
this
yet
budget
all
has
the
a down
policies
payment on that growth.
all the policies you've announced are about putting a burden on business,
No,
the
that's not
engine
true.
of growth.
It's not true.
Well, it is.
If you look at the investment in our industrial strategy for key sectors in the economy, money for aerospace and automotive and electric vehicles, a commitment to keep our research and development funding ahead of the pack in terms of the history here in this country in comparison to other countries. If you look at the 10-year infrastructure strategy, if you look at the investment in transport and housing, which enables city regions to grow because it meets the needs of expanding populations, there are enormous numbers of policies in this budget that are good for growth in Britain, but it will take some time to be delivered, and that has been recognised by the OBR in the numbers today.
Faisal.
Joe, I mean, this is obviously a mammoth budget. I mean, just be clear to the viewers about the scale of change. 70 billion a year in extra spending, 2% of the size of our economy, 1%, as we were talking about, in extra taxes, 1% in extra spending. And it takes us to sort of national highs in terms of taxes as a proportion of GDP, the size of the state fundamentally higher than the pandemic. Can you be honest about this, looking forward? That this, if you like, the model for the UK economy has changed. We're now more like a continental European economy with a bigger state and higher taxes, and that is what Labour will preside over, and that is what you want. That's your model.
I just slightly challenge the premise of your question that I've not been honest so far. I've been
Okay.
entirely honest.
Okay.
Every answer I've given you today, so I would just take that back if I were you. But in terms of the second part of your question, that we recognise that we've inherited an economy, we've inherited a set of public services that are not match fit. They're absolutely not match fit. We've got to invest and modernise and improve our public services so that they cost less in the future. But we've got to
It's
get
going to get
growth.
washed out in wages, though, isn't it?
But, well, look, all of these things are difficult, but that is the job we've got to do, and we've got to get growth back into the economy, because that is the only sustainable route to getting a grip of public finances and delivering the right outcomes for this country. I'm the first to recognise that's a really hard job to do, especially with the inheritance that we've had from 14 years of the Conservatives, but that is what this budget does today. It chooses investment over decline, it matches the scale of the challenges we face as a country, and it is the starting gun for a decade of national renewal that we promised at the election.
On the continental European model. That's what the UK under the Labour government is pursuing now.
Well, we set out the fiscal rules in the budget today. We want debt falling as the size of the economy. We're going to have all of our day-to-day spending paid for by tax receipts, which we will meet in 27-28 on a rolling basis. That is the trajectory of growth for this country going forward.
I should say, despite all those numbers, and this will be better news, I think, for the Chief Secretary, the reaction in the markets is totally benign.
Well,
it's like the gilt yield's actually fallen and continued to
But they
fall.
had risen a little bit over the
Beforehand,
past
yes,
few
but
weeks.
you know, it is rather intriguing given the sorts of sums I just talked
Well,
about.
I'm glad people think it's good news, because I do as well.
Right, well, there is a political risk, isn't there, Vicky? If taxes are going up, spending is going up, borrowing is going up. Yes, we've seen the figures of some growth, perhaps coming down the track over the next few years. That's the prediction, but it is still a big political gamble.
Yeah, and I think, look, you know, Labour have made the assessment, and the government now have made the assessment that people want and are happy to see taxes go up in order to fund public services, which they felt under the last government weren't working properly in all sorts of areas. Now, I think the big question might be, how soon might people see a difference? And I think what's interesting here is that, you know, there's a lot of money there going into the NHS, £22 billion extra over 2 years. During the election, Wes Streeting talked a lot about it not really being about more money. He talked about it being about reform, and yet a huge chunk of those tax rises seem to be going towards the NHS. And I'm just interested whether you think people will start to see a change very quickly or not, and what that change might be, not just in the NHS, but elsewhere as well. Because if, you know, Paul's right, the money's going in quickly and early and then tails off, how soon can those changes be seen?
Sure. So in terms of our first steps, so for example on health, 40,000 additional appointments a week at hospital to clear the elective waiting list backlog, people will see that immediately. That will continue to deliver through this year and into next year, and we're very, very confident about that.
So 2 years.
We will deliver our first steps, yes, within those 2 years, without question. there's clearly a lot more to do, but that was the first step we set out in our manifesto. Capital investment into new scanners and technology and hospital buildings and dealing with, RAC and, that takes time to order and install and build and get off the ground. Of course it will, and that will take time to get there. But Wes is the first person to recognise that he has to reform the National Health Service, not just for its own purposes, but because it is the engine of opportunity and growth in our country when so many people are off work sick and unable to be in gainful employment. So there's
Isn't
an
it
important
strange
role
to
for it
put the
in
money
economy.
in before the 10-year plan for the NHS? I mean, that's not coming till the spring, is it? And, there was no mention much about social care. But, that plan is coming, and yet you're putting in billions of pounds now before we've got that.
So we have two problems. One was this black hole in the NHS that we inherited from the Conservatives. They had tons of bills coming in with no money put aside to pay for them. We've prioritised money to pay for those bills, to maintain the activity that the NHS is currently able to perform, to get junior doctors back into the hospitals and off of strikes. That's a decision that we took, yes. But actually the 10-year strategy will align with this second phase of our spending review now coming out of the budget, where we'll allocate the funding that Rachel has announced today over the years ahead and confirm that in the spring.
But again, the Prime Minister said there will be no more money for the NHS without reform.
Yep.
And you are doing the money first.
I know, but the reform has to come. I mean, it's together. It's not one or the other. There's money, but there is reform.
But again, he was very clear, no more money. And now there's billions, and rightly maybe, going into the NHS before we've seen the reform.
Well, no, and an absolute expectation that reform starts immediately. There's no question of that, both in health and education and other areas of public services.
Well,
you can't just keep on this trajectory of more money without reform. It's a non-negotiable.
Except you have just
No,
done
no,
that.
because
We have had a number of years where that has been the case. I mean, the reform that other,
There's been
previous
chat of
government have
reform.
asked for.
There's been chat of reform, but not delivery.
Well, we haven't seen the delivery yet, but we'll
give us
take what
time.
you say.
Give us time.
Well, that's the problem. How much time? I mean, Paul Johnson, while we're talking about public services, Rachel Reeves was very keen to emphasise there will be no return to austerity. Has she met that commitment?
Well, over the next 2 years with knobs on, I mean, this is an enormous increase in spending this year and next. But as I understand it, the increase between 2025, 26 and the end of the forecast period is 1.5% a year. That is barely enough. And on some definitions, probably not enough, because we know that National Health Service will get a lot more than that, Defence will get more than that, and so on. So you might just about be able to hold non-protected departments constant in real terms over that period. You certainly wouldn't be able to get them going up in line with national income. So it might be just about enough, but it's pretty close. But it is, we'll say, after a great big increase this year and next.
Even with all these tax increases?
Well, the big tax increases to a large extent are paying for the big increases that we're seeing this year and next. And of course, they'll follow through. So total spending 5 or 6 years down the line will be a lot higher than under what the OBR called fictional plans of the last government. This government's absolutely right. I mean, the last government was planning big cuts in day-to-day spending, huge cuts in investment spending. Cuts almost certainly wouldn't have occurred, or if they had, would have been a big return to austerity. So this government's moved away from that, but it has really front-loaded its spending plans, and it's going to be really tight after next year.
Right, so there could be a return to almost austerity for unprotected, as we called them, departments. And we've already seen the state of our prisons with early release schemes and the need to build more prison places. What will happen in 2 years' time to the court system, to prisons?
Yep, so there won't be a return to austerity, but Paul is totally right. The reason you get a big bump now is because we're wiping the slate clean from the inheritance we got from the Conservatives. We're filling in those black holes, we're settling public sector pay, we're setting the new honest baseline of public spending for public services, and then we build from there around reform and growth. So the second phase of the spending review will be difficult. There is no denying that, and we will work through that over the coming months. But you're right, there are issues across the whole of the public sector estate, whether it's the criminal justice system, health we've talked about, SEND and education, looked after children, social care. There are lots of areas that we need to roll up our sleeves and get on with reforming. And that's now the hard yards and the work that we have to do as the government in the years ahead.
Can I say, you made a claim at the beginning about how it's going to have a one-off, like don't intend to come back for further tax rises. But if this picture of public spending doesn't work out, if the spending pressures require more top-ups, surely you will have to come back for more tax rises later in the Parliament.
Well, as I say, our promise in the manifesto about not increasing income tax, national insurance or VAT on working people, and our corporation tax rate for business is a promise that we will honour for the whole time that we are in government before the next election. So that's a non-negotiable. The second point is, of course, this reform and growth agenda we have to get right. That is the big challenge for us in government, and that's the challenge that we're accepting today, that we have to prioritise.
Can I ask you, there's a big claim made that the OBR has, if you like, helped you blame the previous government for this black hole. It's not quite like that in terms of the OBR review, is it? They don't really point the finger. They don't say that the forecast changes would have breached the fiscal rule, for example.
Well, what they do say is that they didn't have all the information that they should have had from the last government, and had they had that information, the forecast that they produced in March for the last Conservative budget would have been, quote, materially different, which has an impact in terms of the forecast that comes out today for this budget.
But not a 40 billion tax raising impact.
But still materially different, to use the language of the OBR. The OBR is not political, it's independent, as you know, and it's been very clear about that.
But you might have gold-plated what the OBR have said to make to justify the 40 billion in tax rises.
It's not about justifying a choice, it's about dealing with the reality as we find it. And as I say, I recognise this is a budget that matches the scale of the challenges we face, but that's the choice that we've
Except,
taken.
as you know, and in fact I think the IFS have said before, the books were open. Darren, there was everything was there for you for you to look at. But again, it's about trust. People have got to trust you, and you know the polls recently have seen trust really take a dip.
Yeah.
Personally against the Prime Minister and against the government as a whole. Now, you may sit here and say, we have kept to all our commitments, as we heard Rachel Reeves say, but people obviously don't agree with you. That cynicism because the polls are saying they feel you haven't
There's
or
not been a
wouldn't
poll
be
since the budget.
No, not since the budget, but on all of the discussion leading up to it about tax rises. And actually, we have a graphic to show, it's disappeared, to show the projection of taxes going up as a proportion of GDP when you said that the previous Conservative government and other administrations had taken this country to the highest tax burden on record. But you're not going to be bringing it down anytime soon.
So look, you know.